Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see you all out here this evening on this gorgeous and sunny, brisk, but sunny Tuesday evening. I am pleased to welcome you to the Methodist Theological School in Ohio and to our event this evening. Dr. Francesca Nuzzolese is Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling here at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. She holds a THD in Pastoral Counseling from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, as well as a THM from Melbourne College of Divinity in Melbourne, Australia. Before joining the faculty at MTSO, she held a tenured faculty position at Palmer Theological Seminary and Eastern University, teaching in the areas of spiritual formation, pastoral care and counseling, and pastoral theology. Dr. Nuzzolese is author of Just Care, Pastoral Counseling with Socioeconomically Vulnerable Women. Other publications appear in Prism Magazine, the Journal of Pastoral Psychology, the Journal of Pastoral Theology, the Baptist Witness of Australia, and Women Out of Order. As a scholar practitioner, Dr. Nuzzolese is committed to the organic integration of theory and pastoral praxis, issues of faith and social justice. She leads spiritual retreats, teaches internationally, and offers educational workshops on a variety of psycho-spiritual and social issues, such as the sexual labor and exploitation of women and children around the world. Her latest project of research focuses on the impact of trauma on individuals and communities who are subjected to different forms of exploitation and dehumanization. Outside of the academic context, she is involved in private psychotherapeutic practice, psychospiritual education, spiritual direction, and anti-trafficking advocacy. She consults with anti-trafficking groups and faith-based NGOs in Europe, Russia, Southeast and Central Asia, Africa, and Australia, and she is the founder and director of Be the Lifeline, which is an NGO committed to providing care, support, and ongoing psychospiritual education to anti-trafficking service providers and first responders in war zones and places of deep traumatic impact. Dr. Nuzzolese's lecture this evening is entitled Redefining the Trauma Zone, a Psychospiritual Assessment of the State of the World. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you from my heart to all of you for being here. It is really, it's humbling, you know, to have friends and students and colleagues who are interested in trauma, because it's not a fun topic. And I imagine, you know, that some of you in the room might be involved professionally with people impacted by trauma. And some of you, some of us, if the statistics are right, carry some of that woundedness in our own selves. So I approach this topic with deep respect, and I invite you to do the same. What has informed me is stories and narratives and the sharing of a lot of people that I've encountered around the world, and I hold these stories really sacredly. I don't use them to make a point, but I try to use them to learn, continue to grow, and possibly make a difference because of what I learn. And so that's my intent tonight, you know, to share a little bit of my journey through this work that happens a lot on the ground, you know, with people. And very rarely I have the opportunity to really take the aerial view, sometimes literally only when I'm on the plane coming back. And I think, what did just happen? You know, I kind of immersed myself into this crazy space and heard all of this, and now what do I do with all of that? So tonight, I really thank you for being my guests on this journey of tracking with me a little bit what I've been thinking and processing in relation to this international work, but also my experience of living here in the United States. So my aim is to really share with you this idea of the trauma zone And I'm going to give you a task. I hope that by the end, when I stop and you start engaging with me, you give me a feedback and see if I am indeed myself in a traumatic space, and that's why I see everything through this lens of trauma, or if indeed I have a point, that what I've observed actually is valid, and that you can resonate with that experience from your own location. So that's really my intent, I really want this engagement, because it can be very isolating, and it can be a little crazy making, to just enter spaces where reality is so meshed with memory, fantasy, flashback, and woundedness, So to re-enter sometimes the normal space, it's a little bit tricky. So I'm going to start with defining really quickly, just for those of you who might not be, in the academic environment, what is my lens? I talk about this psycho-spiritual lens, and I had the good idea of looking it up online to see what other people are saying about psycho-spiritual, and I found some really crazy comments about, spiritual people don't need psychology, this is really bad for you, trust the scripture. I was like, no, that's not how I use it, I'm a pastoral theologian. That means I try to construct theology out of pastoral experience, So practicing care is very essential to me. That's the place from which I draw information about human life and the connectedness to God. And so what I focus on, the disciplines that I use are primarily psychology, theology, and spirituality. And that's because I'm interested in human behavior, but also in contributing to human flourishing. And the spiritual dimension of people's lives is an essential component of this flourishing from my perspective. So that's a little bit about that. Then the method that I use in order to do research is the one of participant researcher. Since I'm teaching a course on research method, some students are here, I think it's always important to make clear where our source of data comes from. And for a practitioner of care, obviously the information comes from participating. So I can never claim to be objective about anything that happens to me, because I'm in a counseling session, whatever happens between me and the client or the person is already in an intersubjective space, it's already been transformed by my listening, my interpreting. So when I try to make sense of that story outside of that context, I've already modified the information. But I think that's a legitimate method, for people who are interested not in observing reality, but immersing themselves into reality. And I think this is a key word for my work, immersion. I really like to go into the spaces of trauma, not because I like them. Nobody chooses that. It kind of chooses you, you kind of respond to a need. And I will illustrate that a bit better in a minute, how that came to be. So just to be clear still about language, I wanted to, and again, because I assume not everybody is familiar with the same terminology, I think the first few minutes I want to spend just giving the basics. What are we talking about when we use this word, trauma? And here you have the clinical definition, and which is, it's a natural human response to something catastrophic, an accident, the news of an illness, a terminal illness you have to go through, or rape, there's a variety of forms in which trauma hits us. But the bottom line, which is my bold there, is that the impact of trauma leaves us forever changed. There's never life that goes back to normal, ever. There's different ways that people understand how to integrate the experience of trauma, how to move through it, how to experience growth out of it, but there is never a going back to the before. And I actually like to share a theological definition of it by my friend and colleague Shelley Rambo, who teaches at Boston University. She's done a lot of theological thinking about trauma. And she says, trauma is the suffering that remains. Trauma is the suffering that remains. This simple definition speaks to the problem of integration that lies at the heart of traumatic experience. While definitions of trauma differ, one common denominator is the notion that traumatic experiences overwhelm human processes of adaptation. So adapting, returning to normal life is the essence of the problem. So that's why we have the clinical community has come up with this definition of a syndrome, the post-traumatic stress disorder that was initially designed to describe the experience of veterans coming back from war and the flashbacks and the adaptation that they couldn't, the integration into normal life that they couldn't bear. And so the post-traumatic stress disorder has a certain trajectory, if the symptoms like flashbacks, insomnia, gastrointestinal, the body, I brought my best friend here, the body keeps the score. If you're ever interested in trauma, you'll get a bibliography at the end that I've put together for you of key books that I've used that are very informative. But this is one of the best I know. It makes the understanding of trauma so accessible and yet honors all the complexity of it. So it doesn't diminish the value just because it's written so well and clinically and humanly appropriate from my perspective. So the symptoms can stay for a long time, and so we have a syndrome, a condition, with which people can be now diagnosed and treated and receive care in a way that before they couldn't, So the introduction of this diagnosis, this diagnostical criteria is really excellent. But I think there is a critique of this as well, that it can also try to pigeonhole and narrow down too much experiences that are hard to describe and to put into words. Some people go back to life as normal, but that doesn't mean that they're not impacted by the trauma. They're just living in a dissociative state, right? They just blocked it out so well, they now pretend that life is as it was before, but it's not. It doesn't mean that they weren't impacted and that this traumatic experience is living in their body. And that's where the research has really helped us to see how the body keeps the score of the trauma. Then people are found out with certain illnesses, then they get correlated to an experience of trauma they had in childhood or in some other time in their life, if that makes sense. So that I want to move to my offering for tonight, and I'm going to put it just in a statement for right now, but then what I want to do with the rest of my time is to unpack it to see if this makes sense to you. So trauma zone, and I want to tell you where this concept comes from, and I thank Danny for encouraging me to spell it out, because when I gave the title, he said, you sure everybody knows what you're talking about? And I kind of, I thought, oh, we talk about war zone. It's like, it's a terrible place to be. Don't go Philadelphia. Don't go to that area. It's like a war zone. I remember friends saying that to me. So, it's a zone where you experience fear or, there is danger. But the notion really comes from this colleague in Philadelphia who was really working in the ghetto and really with gangs. And he wanted to find a way to break through their experience and to show that what they were acting out, all the violence, was really an expression of their own trauma that they had never healed. And so it was so much trying to break, into that community that he came up with this idea of the trauma zone. And he was like, dude, you're in the zone, you got the tape, you got the DJ talking to you, and saying, don't do this, do that, and he was trying to break it to a point where people could. And I saw him do a presentation in my class. I invited him, and I was a little bit, it's not really, scholarly, and but I just had a change of heart about it. I just thought, what a brilliant man, he's trying to make a difference in a community that has a really hard time acknowledging vulnerability. Like they're acting out of their brokenness. So he's speaking a language. And how much of that I long to do, with my students and with my clients. So I read the book. It's called Trauma Zone. And it's kind of interesting and it's kind of light, but that idea stuck with me. And as I continue to work around the world and enter these areas of trauma, I have begun to think, what if we are all in a trauma zone? I mean, where we've learned to relate to each other as if we are all acting out some kind of PTSD, right? There's something about the impact through the news, through the realities we live in our cities and in our communities, the politics, that makes us act sometimes as if we are in a dissociated mode, or if we are in the grips of helplessness, powerlessness, shame, which are all the symptoms of trauma. And this is how we've been living now for generations. And so this is kind of my thesis, what if the trauma zone is the relational space where people act as traumatized to one another? And so if that's the case, if I'm able to persuade you with my experience and the data I've collected around the world, maybe what's toward the end of this, what is important for us to do is to think together, how do we reduce the impact of that zone? Because I don't think we can step out of it because it's not a geographical space, if that makes sense, right? Because it's a relational space. So in order to shrink the impact, we have to change the way we are to each other. So, and that's complicated because a traumatized person in the grips of PTSD, you can't just talk them out of behavior. It's difficult. It's very gentle, delicate, and long-term work. So that's the prognosis. That's what we can expect with each other. But it's possible. Healing and growth are possible. That's the hope that comes from my theology. So I want to hold on to that. So I'm going to, now that we've clarified sort of, the terms, at least, of engagement, I'm going to share with you from one of my first professors in pastoral care, Deborah Hansinger. She is now at Princeton, but she came to Switzerland when I was a student there, and she was the first that introduced me to the idea of bringing psychology and theology together. I'm forever grateful for that, because we were living really difficult years in that time, and she helped me see how you can understand human behavior with a different lens. So I want to share from her. I've adapted this a little bit, of course, but this concentric view of trauma, to see the different spheres in which trauma insidiously meets our life. And the first space is the intrapsychic. It's like at the very core, we know that we are finite, we're broken, we're limited, and we have an infinite capacity for evil. And that when people experience that in their own body, like the capacity to hurt your own child because you had a rage, or to hurt your spouse because you were in a moment of fatigue and stress, that capacity puts us in touch with something core that is very traumatic about human nature. Now, not many people live in that space, but that's an important one, especially for students that are, interested in doing counseling and internal work, to really get to the root of this sometimes. It's the most subtle, but it's the closest to our soul, the space. Then moving outside, there is the interpersonal forms of trauma that we experience. And that's anything from divorce, illness, death, homicide, suicide, living with disability, just forms of trauma that impact our being in the world, our being with each other. And because we're deeply relational, interrelational, the trauma impacts everything, And so in this interpersonal sphere is this sphere which people sometimes bring to counseling. It's because that's where they can put a finger on, okay, I'm going through divorce, this is really horrific, or I'm in touch with being abused as a child, and now I'm an adult and I'm having difficulties relating. And so, this is the sphere that people, at least that I could identify, more closely with the work that we do. But then there is an outer layer where there is a form of trauma that now is coming into the literature more and more. cultural anthropologists, philosophers, theologians are writing a lot about this now, the structural intersystemic forms of evil, of evil, yes, that they then impact us in a traumatic way. So people living in poverty, people living with moral injury, and I will speak a little bit about this a bit later, discrimination, exploitation, these are kind of insidious, subtle forms of violence on the body, on the soul, on the psyche that impact the way we live. Sometimes people don't identify that so clearly when they come to counseling, but it's our job sometimes to point to that layer also as part of what brings the oppression into a family, into a couple, right? This is the legacy of the past, the intergenerational transmission of trauma that people live out or act out. And so that's important to know and to name. And then in the outer sphere, in the larger circle, we find what Dr. Hansinger calls hell, but I call it the space of evil forces, this is forms of like terrorism, in countries where war goes on for decades and children are born into fear and threat and constant threat to their lives, so that we talk about generations of people that have never known life normal or like we intend for normal. And so that kind of trauma is, I identify, although I find it a bit strong with the word hell, it's living a life that is not worth living in a way. These are the people who have nothing to lose. They go to combat with the idea that, the afterlife is going to be so much better. This is an insidious, deeply embedded form of trauma, I think, that inspires or, kind of motivates, drives people to these kind of behaviors. And so all of these, although they're concentric, like they're nonlinear, they all impact on each other, And then in my view, all of this creates the complexity of trauma, because you can never be on one level and not be touched by the other, right? They're all interlayered and all intersecting. And that's how I think about the trauma zone, So you can never say, I have not been touched by a form of ecological disaster, like the things that kill hundreds and thousands of people come into our news, they affect us somehow. In our, even if they're not in our geographical region, they're in our country. These are people. We have friends, We call ourselves the family of God, the children of God. We're brothers and sisters. Somehow, the impact of that trauma has got to have an effect on us. It would be non-human not to feel that. And so that's my point. We're all in a trauma zone, whether we are touched personally, directly, or indirectly. It's all part of our experience. It becomes sometimes so subconscious and layered deep that we are not acting consciously, out of it, but it's there nevertheless. So here, the trauma zone around the world. Here I enter a little bit more closely into the journeys I've taken around the world. And these are the countries where I have in some way collaborated, but visited personally, either to do some training on trauma. Complex trauma was the context of my trip to Nepal, for which I'm so grateful that MTSO and Theological Commons supported me financially to take that trip. It wasn't a conference, and I really appreciated the trust, that although it wasn't an academic paper I was giving, I was collecting, information. I was learning by teaching about complex trauma. And so one of the first things I did with the group, I had about 30 people. They came from the medical field and some from social worker, counselors. The first question that occurred to me was like, where have you learned this word? Where is your translation in Nepali of this trauma? And they didn't have one. It's just words that we've taken from the West. And sometimes I have a problem with that because, sometimes people internalize things, so they take them on as diagnostic criteria, for things that are not indigenous to them, So, and nevertheless, they were really interested in this phenomenon of complex trauma. And complex trauma is a kind of a new development in the research of trauma. It basically tracks the trauma that occurs to children, you know, at a very early stage, and then how the accumulation of trauma transforms them in the kind of adults that they are. You know, so this is like a repetitive, unexpected, intermittent, you know, from the people who live, for instance, in refugee camps. I mean, imagine a child that is born, has no passport, is born probably out of rape, because a lot of the women get raped in refugee camps, and kids are not, they are not claimed by anybody. Even their own moms reject them because they're the product of trauma and hurt. So you have hundreds of thousands of kids that are just free merchandise, you know, for organizations that are totally corrupt to sell them as labor, you know, as sex slaves, you name it. It's really horrific out there. So in Nepal, I go to teach about complex trauma, and I'm curious about where they have inherited this word, and they said, oh, there was a professor from Germany that came to teach at the University of Kathmandu and told us this is the latest research. So they contacted me and they asked me to talk about it. It was interesting, and I learned a lot from listening to them and their experience. And indeed, I thought they had it right, meaning they are really the victims or the survivors of complex trauma. I mean, Nepal is really in utter poverty. They had an earthquake 3 years ago. It still has the wounds on the earth, you know, like craters like this in the middle of the street. Nothing has been done to repair anything. You just feel like it happened yesterday. So some pieces of the city are built and some are completely destroyed. And in the villages, they did not receive help for months. So people are grieving their dead bodies. And that's what the people were, the doctors that were in the room, they were asking, you know, how do we care for these people? They're still mourning the kids they never found, and you know, the bodies that they could never bury. And that's where all the theory and all the great psychological knowledge finds a stop. You know, it was in that room there was a need for therapy group, not for instruction. You know. I mean, that is what I'm thankful for, that gift of being able to drop the theory and just move into a space of care. But, you know, I balanced it because I also wanted to give them content, which I think they will treasure. And I had enough time to do that. But just wanted to share briefly about that because in all of these countries, I've gone, this is the one common element, I've gone for one purpose, and I came back with a totally different one. I want to tell you the experience in Sierra Leone, where I went to do like a care for frontliners, they call them. You know, it's the people who are in the front line of sex trafficking for children. They get, as soon as they're born, they get sold. So they do this watch. And this organization called World Hope International, yes, World Hope International, through friends, you know, contacted me and said, could you do some work, trauma work with the practitioners? Because no matter how much work they do, they see so many kids slipping. You know, they manage to sell them over the border. And so I went with that intent to do care for them or whatever. And I went with all my tools, you know, arts and crafts, because the language can be a problem sometimes, so to communicate through activities, you know, I try to be as creative as possible. And the day I arrived, oh, there was the rainy season. I put all my bags and everything was washed away. It rained everything down, my clothes, my tools, my handouts, famous, I always have a handout, I don't know why, even people who don't like, Nicole knows that. I brought a handout to the Muslim women. And after 3 minutes, I had to drop it and just go with the flow. We'll be done. Of course, they couldn't even read the English. It didn't occur to me. I had a translator, but you know, I just went all prepared with my handout. You know, it makes me feel strong to have a handout. And I just, you know, there, and the news came on my trip that organization, World Hope International, was closing that project. So they thought it was good timing that I was spending a week with them so that I could help them process the fact that we're going to be without a job the next month. we're talking about 45 people, that work for an organization. It was devastating, and it was such a bad setup for me. I mean, that was horrible. But talk about being creative and dropping. So it feels like, these are a lot of different spaces where I could have collected decent data, but in the end, it just gets all transformed, But and this is my opportunity in a way to look at that map all over as it is, and think about some of these experiences and kind of extract some of the work. And I've tried to organize it in 3 categories, And so the first one is that my work has been centered around sexual trauma. I did not ever choose that. When people say, how did you get into human trafficking? Like, I didn't get into it, It's just, I started in training in Atlanta when I was working on my doctorate, and I started to see women that talk about something very basic, like, a presenting problem, like I have a problem with my husband, we don't get along, or the teenagers, And you scratch a little bit, and the history of some kind of sexual violation. Not everybody, but a lot of women do, because that's unfortunately the story of women in the world, that the vulnerability to sexual violation, molestation, inappropriate touch leaves such a mark. That even the one episode, one, inappropriate touch, one experience lingers forever and really changes the trajectory of their ability to trust, to have intimacy, to have normal sexual engagement, And so that just kind of signed the trajectory for me. It's not that I chose it, but I needed to learn in order to be effective. And so that became an expertise by default. But little by little, I took it on as a real challenge and a compelling, force, to take me into the world to understand how a lot of women are affected by sexual exploitation in particular. They're used as bodies for sex, and they're sold and contracted, and that's what took me to Thailand and Southeast Asia, the Netherlands. On the spectrum, I've seen it all, from people being literally abducted, to women who are sold by their parents in exchange for food. Tribal girls in Thailand was shocked, but it was very well thought out, and it was an economic plan for survival of the village. The girls, after they get of age, they can be sold to the brothels because that brings regular income to the village, it helps support the other. You have to drop your value judgments in these situations and try to understand the complexity of the context. And so from that to the big cities in Europe, Amsterdam, I spent a whole sabbatical, 3 months there, one time just interviewing women in the windows. And, who claim to choose, sex work as their legitimate form of income because they feel they can earn money and they can build a decent life. And it's not so much of a sacrifice, it's just a transaction, they transaction a part of their body for a certain amount of time. And there again, I try to suspend my judgment because I really want to understand human experience. But I cannot help, then draw my conclusions about what that does to the body of a human being. And not just to the person, to the women, but also to the consumers. What kind of humanity are we fostering when, we think it's okay to transact a part of your body, to kind of think about that. But the themes, like that emerge from that particular world where the sexual trauma is present is this incredible form of shame. The shame is a very insidious kind of the legacy of trauma. It's very difficult to work through. And I think I tried to write a paper one time. My friend Kristen worked for a magazine, and I tried to really wrestle with why the victim feels shame. We should feel angry, but there's an insidiousness about that dynamic. And I think the people who have talked the best about it, that help me make more sense, are the survivors of the Holocaust. who talk about, like Primo Levi was, like an Italian that survived the concentration camps and wrote, If This Is a Man. It was a classic. We had to read it, in middle school. And it impacted me greatly because he talks about shame, the shame of the person that recognizes the other brutality, and so it's the shame of the person that is not shamed, that incorporates the shame of the perpetrator of the abuse, because they have lost enough, all their humanity to feel any form of shame. So it's introjected, psychologically. So they carry the shame for what they've been poured into. And it's kind of a subtle dynamic. It's really difficult then to work through it, in counseling or through trauma care. Because some of the symptoms you can work through, but these insidious places where the identity of the person is compromised from their perspective, that's a very difficult journey to recover from. So other common symptoms of sexual trauma, the legacy of sexual trauma, is the skewed sense of intimacy, the difficulty, in creating healthy relationships, and so on. And in some of these countries they still hold the child marriage. This is very tragic. Like what girls go through, with their reproductive system, where they're violated at a very young age, 8, 10, and then they're rejected because if they cannot reproduce children or if they're not good for sex, then they get thrown in the streets. And that's the reason why I got to meet this kind of population, is because they're usually rescued by faith-based organizations, that try to care for the most vulnerable. We use that phrase, who are the most vulnerable in our world? Some of these girls are. Rejected. The family doesn't want them anymore. They handed them out. The husband now rejects them, puts them in the street. There is no society, caste system in India. That's one of the places where this is practiced. And it's just really devastating to see what kind of trajectory of life they are facing. But another form of, or another category that I have been able to localize, if you will, is the trauma of dislocation. It's just this phenomenon of migration, that people, for economic reasons, for political, for ecological disasters, they're forced to move and to lose the sense of place and belonging, and that can be really devastating. But I had to do some real work on myself with this one, because I recognize that I have been a migrant, an immigrant, actually, since I was 18. So I've lived most of my adult life as an immigrant. And once I claimed that as an identity, in a way, it helped me really make sense of some of the decisions I've made in my life. Because it is traumatic not to have a sense of belonging. Every time I crossed the border, there was a fear that I would be sent back. Every time, you reapply for a visa. I was a student for many years, and not just here in the States. The States I came later, but I was an immigrant in many other parts of the world. And this sense of not belonging that causes, and I was an immigrant by choice. So I wasn't really forced. I was looking for a better education, was exploring, different parts of the world. But the people that are forced out of their own homes, and what's ironic about this experience is that the absurdity is that no matter how traumatic the experience they left behind, sometimes they wish they could go back to it. And that is really telling about how traumatic the experience of entering another reality is. And this past summer, I spent some time through Mediterranean Hope, which is supported by the Protestants in Europe and the Methodists. I was so proud, that are totally behind this project. And they are in Sicily, where all the boats arrive, from Libya, and a lot don't arrive and die in the Mediterranean Sea. But the ones that arrive, they make it to coast, They have some homes where they welcome them and they give first assistance, so they could be there 3 months up to 6 months, and then they have to be located in Europe, in the countries of their destination. And so this first assistance means you find people that are like, it's really troubling and heartbreaking to see the comments of people, the people that have been migrants themselves, like it happens here, that talk about other migrants as less than human, these people in commercial terms, we don't have enough money for them, they come to take, all this nonsense. But I had the experience of like listening to the women that come with children, or the women they arrive pregnant. That is because they've been raped on the journey. That is not because they left, because it takes an average of 5, sometimes 7 years before they get to Italy. So from the places they leave, they get obstructed multiple times. They get turned into refugee camps where they have to work their way out. They threaten them, they call their families, have to pay money so they can get out again. They make another leg of the journey, they get stopped again. But people don't go on a journey like we do, take a flight and get into Italy. And people from North Africa don't get to Libya in 3-4 hours of car drive. It takes, very, very difficult, torturous journeys. And by the time they get, wherever they get, the trauma they left home seems more appealing. That's really disturbing. And then the way they're treated, there's no dignity. People are treated like animals. They're assembled, in places with no hygiene, and they're already bringing so much sickness, in their bodies, in their souls. And it's really, Jeannie is here. She used to tell me this story a lot, and I took it with me when I went there. It's like, what do you need? How can we help you? Listen. We want to tell our story. This is a really incredible thing, that people that are so at the bottom, of the human scale, so deprived of any form of dignity, they want to be humanized by being seen and heard. And that is part of the power of trauma. It robs people of the dignity to tell your story. The memories get so lumped together and confused. There is, a time warp that happens. There's no clarity about when things happened. And language, the inability to really put words to what is unspeakable, it's what leaves people in that kind of paralysis. There's not much humanity in them, and it's so easy then to discount them. They can't learn the language, they cannot adapt, all the commentary that comes as judgment, because there's a lack of understanding, and there's a lack of listening, and that's part of the problem. But and these authors, that just after the Second World War, were already talking about rightlessness and statuslessness, like Giorgio Agamben, Italian philosopher, Hannah Arendt, they talked about bare life. The people are reduced to bare existence, and that's one way that we can use them. They're part of the global industry now, but at the time of Hitler, it was easy to exterminate or to attempt to exterminate the Jews because he made them stateless, and so nobody can protect. And so here we are witnessing again a phenomenon, like we have hundreds of thousands of people that are not claimed by anybody. They have a country, they have documents, so they can be used as free labor. And that trauma is not just their trauma. That is our trauma. That's the shared relational space. Because if we can stand that, to live with that reality, that means we are acting as traumatized people, not as decent human beings, that reach out and they can see the injustice of that. That's why I say it's so pervasive that we begin to lose sight exactly of what's happening. So one last form of groupings, if you will, that I've come up with is the trauma of moral injury. Like this concept, was related primarily to war veterans, again, living with the sense of guilt of having acted against their moral compass. So in war, they exterminated children because it was the order. and they did not feel like that was the right thing, but you're not operating out of what's right or wrong within you. You're operating within the context of the commands. And so I've read some material that transposes that concept to other spheres of life, like civilian life, people in this society, for instance, African Americans, that's been attributed maybe to like a way to understand their experience. I had to bear so much injustice and inequality sometimes and act as if it's not, otherwise you get judged, or you get accused. That's so it's like this tricky space of acting as there is no lie in the political system or in the structures in which you survive, which makes you crazy. It makes you act like in dissonance with your belief system or with your sense of what's right, the themis, so it's and that generates a lot of guilt and shame that people then live with that. They're enraged, and we're like, why are you? Look, you have everything. You live in the land of milk and honey here, But there is that insidiousness. So I think we need to pay attention to what's happening, particularly in this country, around that. That's where I think we are really in a trauma zone, because we started to compromise our identity when, the rhetoric, the language is that in order to be a good citizen, you have to hate another kind of race or another kind of people. That becomes insidious. You begin to confuse, where your alliance is, or where you lose really the moral compass. And that's an injury. But if it gets recognized, like it was recognized PTSD, and then you can do something about it, right? Coming out of denial is one of the ways we can heal. But if we are in denial, if it's so subtle that we are not aware of it, then it's complicated, So I think that's where, the conversation can become difficult and tricky and touchy, but I think that's not a reason not to have it, right? It is more important to have it because of that. So, moving forward, this is my redefinition of the trauma zone. I think I already hinted to that in particular, but I wanted to highlight still even more, some of the spaces in which we are being impacted and sometimes not acknowledging. So the humanitarian industry is indeed an industry. It's all the people that go to help the world, People like myself, sometimes I want to rescue the people that are in trouble. And the consequences are these incredible rates of compassion fatigue. The brain goes on, I don't care anymore mode, because you can't take it anymore. But you know how many people are involved in the humanitarian industry? There's a lot of us. Americans are like the leading nation in these efforts. So what that means is there's a lot of people whose job, and it's an industry, right? Whose job is to be professional carers, like go to other parts of the world or in this part of the world. Well, they're carrying a lot of trauma, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue. It's impossible not to be affected when you are, 24/7 involved in situations of care in the front lines. And so if you know any of them, if they are in your family, and if you are yourself one of them, you are in the trauma zone, because it's not possible not to be impacted. And so then the other space is the relational space that I was trying to highlight before. It's like, how have we become with each other? The divisiveness we experience because of politics these days is really scary. Like, we can't really connect. There's a lot of aggression that goes up immediately. It feels to me like we act out as traumatized people, They can't handle a conversation. We flare up. Immediately, there is something like when we are in the trauma zone, and Dr. Collins was saying the DJ begins to speak inside your head, and you go against your own will, and you act and behave as if you are being so attacked in that moment, that you have to, fight for dear life. Fight. flight, freeze. The primary responses of a traumatized person, you know? And I feel like that's what I experienced. You know, when I was in Philadelphia, I still had a decent private practice of, you know, people in counseling. And I wasn't particularly working with deeply traumatized people unless I took this lens, which I now take, you know. So ordinary people that come to counseling because they are in transition or they look for a new vocation. And what I found myself working with is this sense of complete alienation. You know, going to the bottom, using my psycho-spiritual lens, this isn't just an interpersonal thing happening. There's something really core, you know, that is disturbing our society at the moment. And now I see, with this lens, if I put on these glasses, you know, that is the impact of trauma on all of us, you know, with acting out of such a space. And then the last place is more obvious. You know, the barricading, you know, creating the walls. I mean, you tell me if that is not a form of, you know, visceral, physical form of like we've got to defend, we're being attacked. They put a wall. This is actually at the space in Tijuana at the border. I've been there, like where people do communion with the people that have been separated, people that have been deported. Every Sunday there is a church group interfaith that brings, interdenominational, you know, they bring communion to people that are separated at the border. And it's beautiful because people come up with creative things, but it's also devastating, you know, what's happening to our community because of that. So I'm coming close to the end so that we can have some conversation. How do we think about shrinking the trauma zone? I had first on the title, stepping out of the trauma zone. Then I corrected myself. I was like, this is not a geographical space. You know, we can't just step out of anything because we are immersed in life. We just have to find a new way to be with each other. So as I think about my work with individual people, you know, in therapy, I think, what are the basic needs? When a person is in deep trauma, what do they need? They need somebody who understands trauma. So not just any kind of attention, you need competent attention. You need to understand if they are in the grips of a flaring up or not, and to calm them or to give them the tools. And they need caring others. You know, people don't do this by themselves. Of course, there are always exceptions, you know, but people need to be heard, to be held, and they need spaces that are safe, where they can practice living in a different way. Right? They've been acting with a lot of defenses. Can I practice trusting another human being? You know, you need the space for that. So then I transpose that to community, which is a little hard, you know, because it doesn't go really parallel. Freud tried this, and he's been criticized a lot. He tried to talk about individual experiences and collective experience, and Jung did the same. A lot of people have tried that, and it's not quite identical, you know. So I thought, it's not what we need as communities, but what kind of virtues do we need to cultivate in our world so that we can shrink the impact of the trauma zone? And I was thinking, just the awareness, you know, that people can say, it's true, there's something really violent subtly happening in my life, and I cannot put a finger on it, but, you know, coming out of that with honesty, with courage, with humility to ask for help, and self-compassion. This is something that our Buddhist brothers and sisters, you know, teach us a lot. We don't have a lot of self-compassion. We don't know how to give to ourselves, you know, the kind of care and love that we need. That's also a very typical behavior of a traumatized person. They have a lot of loathing, a lot of shame. They don't know how to care for themselves. That's why they need others to mirror that. So to practice something like that would not be bad. And spiritual and moral imagination. You know, there's some therapeutic techniques that we teach in counseling that are really beautiful. And it's like, imagine life as if. Not as it is, but life otherwise. Like if you could have it otherwise. And theologians have, you know, written about this in relation to trauma very beautifully, you know, like how to live between two worlds, acknowledge the suffering and pain that is in the world, but continue to project and offer and invite different ways of being, which project life as if. Imagine life as if we could act differently and relate differently. What would it be like? It's very hard to do in the moment, you know? That's why practicing compassion and being, so developing our imagination outside of what is, because what is can be really depressing. You know, if you stay with what is, you know, and watch the news and take this as reality, it can bring you down, you know, yeah. So what I thought, we also have some beautiful examples through, this could be potential resources, and this is where my sharing ends, because I haven't really thought through this, but this is what came to me as, you know, a potential, like nature has a way of resurrecting itself. Do you know, like the trauma that the earth lives, and this, our colleague Tim and Elaine can help us work through this, you know, what is it about nature has a resilience, you know, that it just recycles itself, and there's new life in spite of all the evil that are throwing on it, you know. There's a way, so we can maybe take, you know, a look at that to see how to do better. And history does that, right? We have failed as humanity from the very beginning. There's actually a very disturbing book written by an Israeli author that claims that Western civilization is deeply a post-traumatic civilization. From the very beginning, God asking for the sacrifice, and the sacrifice not happening, that's already a post-traumatic episode that impacts the rest of our life and civilization. So if we don't deal with that, we're gonna, you know, keep repeating this cycle. And yet we know that we resurrect somehow. You know, we have really beautiful things happening, and human beings can be so creative and imaginative and genius, you know, in continuing life. So that's in our DNA. So human beings are designed just like part of the whole nature and species to keep going. So there is something about the potential to recreate that is within us. And so my conclusion, I always think, how do we move forward? You know, not what can I do? I hate that question. So please don't ask it. I didn't imagine you would, but you know, it's like, how do we move forward? This is challenging. You know, this is not easy. I've tried to keep it as light and, you know, and as fluid as I could, but you know, to sit in the spaces of trauma is not fun. And so I understand people who don't want to do this work, you know, or run the other way. It's challenging, but I think it's the best way to be fully human. Like to really stay human in this time and age, it is important to immerse ourselves in the suffering and not be caught by it. You know, to maintain a sense of healthy, soulful, hopeful perspective, you know, and to continue to mirror for each other how to be a better society. And so the possibilities are endless, you know, of how we can do that as a community, I think, especially when we create spaces for this kind of conversations, you know. So the call to action for me has got to come, you know, because this is never knowledge as an end in itself, right? I teach this to my students. We never like theory just for the liking of it. You know, it has to be somehow transformative, has to bring something. So my call to action is start watching yourself, you know, like your life, how you are yourself acting, and the communities to which you belong, you know. Are there some things that are not normal, but we have normalized them because that's what trauma does. Oh, it's just a shove, oh, it's just a hit, you know, like we get adjusted to violence so much so that it becomes normal. So, but to have the courage to keep a vision and to name things and to seek together a way to move out of shrinking that zone would be really important. And so that I would like to, you know, close with that, and also invite now some time we have, right, for conversation.
Thank you. The question is, this model that you've presented to me is the best model I've heard yet for a very complicated social phenomena. It's very disturbing, mass shootings. But if you look at the model that you've created, it sort of explains the trauma that emerges from people into society and into unthinkable crime. Do you agree, or can you talk about it?
Well, it's really coming back here that usually disturbs me more. And that's part of why I wanted to take the aerial view, to start beginning to see what is it about a society. I chose this country. I really chose it. I've lived in many places, but I chose this country because I thought there was so much beauty and potential, and the resources were created. Coming from Southern Europe, with a legacy of impossibility and difficulty, I thought, I'm in the land of opportunity. Here we can do it all. But I have seen 20 years exactly I've lived here since I came as an immigrant. And now I'm a citizen, but what does that mean? Now it really hurts me sometimes to think, that just to have a passport makes you belong in a very strange way. But that the phenomenon of like this rage, this racial resurfacing of hatred, the speech that denigrates humanity, that to me, that has a source somewhere else. It's just not politics, it's larger than that. And so I think perhaps the person that I should dig more into is Jung, because he has talked about the shadow, and I think this collective cultural, racial, and ethnic groups have not really delved into the shadow that keeps growing and getting bigger, like the unresolved trauma that keeps being hidden. And then it kind of finds its own way through what we say out of character. That's what they say in Europe. This is not America. It's like we're acting out of character for how they've known this nation to be. And that really strikes a chord, because I agree. To me also this was, like it's an acting out of character. So that in an individual, that's what we say. It was acting out of character. It's the shadow shooting through, in some strange behavior. So I would totally understand mass shootings in particular, or the defensiveness of the barricading, and that all as part of this, breaking through. Thank you. Yeah, Faith.
So you had mentioned our moral imagination and how we might broaden that. So I wanted to ask, I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, but in it he speaks about how with the loss of our connection to the transcendent, we may be working from out of what he calls an immanent framework in which we experience a flattened social imaginary. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how this flatter social imaginary might also limit or affect our moral and spiritual imagination.
Thank you, Faith. No, that's beautiful. I mean, I think part of what I've been thinking about from a spiritual perspective is like what is in our DNA? What is this original goodness that we've lost as human beings, And so to think about transcendence is one of the qualities of being a human from a theological perspective, is the capacity to move outside of the realm of the immanent, as you quoted this author. And I believe that part of our work is really to tap into that. But that's what trauma does. It robs you of that capacity, even if momentarily. But that's the catch problem, right? If we're stuck in a place of depression and hopelessness and darkness, it's difficult to be creative or to imagine, also to transcend the dimension in which we are and to see from a different perspective. So I mean, I don't have the answer for the global community, but I know how, for instance, in a theological community, we can foster that, and encourage our churches or our communities outside of this space to rethink that way. Yeah, James.
So part of my thinking on this is that not only do we have 3 areas that you present of trauma, but there's also a scale of trauma from like 1 to 10, and what you've been talking about a lot is 7 to 12 trauma. And so recognizing that my question is about to go more closer to like the 2 to 5 trauma, I'm interested in the trauma moral inquiry, specifically on what it means if pastors a lot of times have to face a trauma moral inquiry, given who we're associated with, or given where we're called to serve, or given what we're expected to do within our areas, and what does that look like as we live out our lives in calling, or even where we think we're supposed to be.
So if there is, like if what the pastor experience is a form of moral injury, you mean? Like if we can attribute that? I don't know. Did that explanation that I give, resonate with your experience?
For many.
It does. It resonates with many. I mean, some of this, you're my student. I teach you this all the time. Like, we use diagnostic criteria to help us, understand and make sense of people's experience, not to label them. So if there is an explanation that fits and gives meaning and sense to the experience, then I say, okay, that fits. If it helps you understand what you and some of your colleagues are experiencing, I would say try it on, learn more about it. So the importance of finding an explanation is that, it's like having a diagnosis, is that you can move toward healing and treatment, When you don't know what it is or what is misdiagnosed, that's what is problematic, if that makes sense, right? So if you know that that's how you feel, that in these spaces you feel like you have to act because out of your moral compass because of the demands of the denomination or of the congregation, then that could be a great example of moral injury. I think some people have started to try to apply that theory to more civilian, kind of general life experience, and not just to the veterans or the police, not certain categories, but everybody. So, thank you. Yes. Yes, John.
Yeah, so my question is around privilege and trauma. And the wondering is, so what, if privilege is maybe not the opposite of being in the trauma zone, and I think the broadening of that, I found that really helpful. But I'm wondering, and this is for us to ponder, for you maybe to comment, does privilege lift me out of trauma? Does it insulate me from trauma? Or does it mask certain experiences of trauma and traumatize me in different ways? So, I'm thinking about white privilege, gender privilege, and what that does to this kind of conversation. Because in one sense, it's the flip side of trauma, right? To be privileged. And so as I resonate with parts of it, of your argument, that it's broad, and we've all experienced trauma, but I know privilege marks so much of my life. So I'm wrestling with that. How does one intersect those two?
Thank you for that, Jeff. I will think about it, but my kind of gut response as a clinician is that trauma doesn't discriminate. Yeah. So it's the way, I think the only thing that distinguishes, if there is a category of distinction, is how stable and secure we are in our lives when trauma hits, if that makes sense. That's the better correlation. So if I am in a situation of like privilege, which means I have a good home, I grew up healthy, I have access to medical insurance, something happens, I can cope better. So my possibility of, shrinking that trauma zone, like dealing with it, having the right support, access to resources, is going to be much better than people that are already at the bottom in terms of privilege, and then trauma hits, and trauma seems to hit harder on these people. But it just looks like that, I think, because I don't think there is a magic design, that you're like, but, I mean, I remember the lecture by Eleni, our colleague, about how, like ecological disaster hits harder on people who are poor. So there, the idea of privilege, of course. I mean, Nepal, we had an earthquake in Italy that, in Abruzzo, in L'Aquila, that destroyed a whole town. It disappeared. Like, now it was there, and I was to the ground. They've rebuilt it at the best that they could. They built a restaurant in Philadelphia that was exactly like it was there, they claim, I mean, people are creative. They're like, let's get back to town. These people, they still have no electricity, no water, everything, 3 years. I think that's, like the better, but of course, it's a variable that needs to be considered, the privilege we carry, access to resources.
Thank you for a very compelling and evocative presentation, Francesca, Dr. Nuzzolese. And there is interesting work that has been done suggesting that current British politics is a form of post-colonial melancholia and a sense of that informed by grief, unresolved grief, and the sense of loss, kind of a wound to the sense of white superiority. I'm wondering if that can be said about current American politics, that there is this sense of post-colonial melancholia, a woundedness to the sense of white supremacy that is creating all this kind of reaction and the need for wall and protection. And kind of it's a loss to this sense of superiority and protection. And you talked about privilege, where there is kind of a threat to that sense of identity.
And you really want an answer? I was like, I mean, we're friends, we're colleagues, we have conversations. But, grief and loss and, it's all part of traumatic behavior, right? So the people that go to combat to regain the sense of power are acting out of lots of traumatized behavior. So my answer is yes. I think that's how it could be read. Thank you.
Actually, my question follows on that one pretty well, because I was going to talk, you were inviting us to think about how society as a whole experiences trauma. And we haven't talked much about how to heal trauma, but I think you kind of said you don't totally heal trauma. I think you said that.
Yeah.
But the question is, how do you move beyond trauma and then take it to a societal level? I mean, our culture is built on the fact that, estimates are 50 to 100 million people dead that were here before Europeans as a result of colonization, not to mention then slavery and all, the extreme pain that is at the base of our civilization in the Western Hemisphere. How do we move beyond that? I mean, is there a role for ceremony and ritual? I mean, how as a large group, as a civilization, do we begin to move beyond that large a sense of trauma?
That's the $1 million question. Right, but it is, right? Because with an individual, even if we don't talk about healing, it can mean many things, right? If it is recuperation of life as it was, it never goes back to that. Going back to the quote, trauma is suffering that remains. So the scars are always there as a reminder. But there is a whole literature about post-traumatic growth, that people can really turn the traumatic experience by working through it to a new life, So we can do that, I can imagine, as a society. And you mentioned the word ritual. I think one of the most beautiful, I just got back from Turkey literally 2 days ago, and I haven't had an opportunity to share about that, but what I witnessed in that group, and I still need to really process, was lots of women from Central Asia, lots of trauma, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. I never knew there were so many stands in that part of the world. They were all there, 250 women, completely traumatized for generations. You know, there's like violence, domestic violence, rape, abuse. I thought I had seen it all, and I hadn't seen it all yet in the presence. But what this conference did, I was the counselor on the ground, so they asked me to work with the staff, not with the women, because they are not fluent in English. But what they did for me was like a form of trauma care collective. I mean, they had all in the room, and they were translators in Russian, because mostly the organization was Anglo, you know, like British. And what they were doing, I thought, was a beautiful, like intervention on a collective level. There were a lot of rituals to invite people into this, like wailing, mourning, and then healing activities. You know, they bring soothing. And I've never seen something quite like that. You know, I was a little bit skeptic in the beginning. I thought, this is a charismatic group. Gino is going to do healing. But there was something really, really powerful that gave me ideas, you know, about how to work with larger groups. You know, and one of the things that worked the best was art. Art and movement. So because what trauma does is it robs people of language also, you know, the ability to really put into words, to express through movement and through art and through music. And there was a lot of singing and a lot of dancing, and there was like a real expression of cathartic expression of traumatic material that was contained beautifully. And so I thought, wow, that's an example, you know, it's beyond psychology, you know, like the modality of intervening on one-on-one, but it takes the collective. And but this is really the work of our time. I think this is the work of our time, you know, to really think as a society, how do we heal, how do we move forward? And I use the word heal because we can find some form of healing. It doesn't look like maybe what we imagine, you know, but there is restoration, there is resurrection, there is new ways of relating that can express that we moved forward or through something.
Oh, thank you. I work in a place that ought to be the most trauma, because I work in a men's prison. However, listening to you, I've had a revelation that may be the healthiest, least traumatized bunch of people that I know of, because they recognize it and they know it. And the way we work is that what you've just described of ritual and community and people tending to each other is able to happen in certain places. And that's very helpful. And then talking about all of the women, I don't know if you know 1 Billion Rising. Do you know that? Yeah. It's a movement, an international movement of supporting women who have been abused. Mm-hmm. There's 1 billion women a year who are abused in one way or the other, and 1 billion of us are going to stand up all over the world for them. And last Saturday we had a 1 Billion Rising in the men's prison for the women, where the men shared stories. One of the women who was there asked them, how many of you have experienced domestic violence? And they all raised their hands, and she said, leave them up if it was you. And a bunch of them did. I mean, 80% of them did. And so after hearing each other's stories and asking the question, what do we do now? Where do we go now? One of the men stood up and told a story, but his ending was this: we've got to stop it. It's us. We've got to do something. We've got to recognize that we're part of it. And he suggested this: when you hear something, and then he was talking about guys talking about girls. He was talking about the language that they use in the locks and the language that they use with each other about women, but it could be applied anywhere. He said, we're going to do hashtag, dude, that ain't cool. And so we had some conversation afterwards, and I heard 3 or 4 times, dude, that ain't, hashtag dude, that ain't cool. So I think that's what we all need to do, right? Is when we hear it and when we see it, we need to say, hashtag, that's just not cool, and do our little part. Anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you for this. I'm struck by the structural similarities by the way you've talked about trauma and the old doctrine of original sin, as though you've almost laid out a non-Augustinian model for how sin is transmitted through the human community. So I'm wondering if you could say something more about where you maybe see theological connections there.
I did write my whole dissertation on kind of this, on really, I took the Augustinian view to understand how we relate to brokenness and finitude, and how we also make change, how we use free will, like how we try to not deviate, but take that seriously and move into the possibility by using process theology, which is not Augustinian at all, But yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally my thinking is always theological, because that's my primary formation, So it seeps through even when I speak clinical language, right? I have a sense of original goodness that has come by intersecting with other faith traditions, and and also trying to engage, like to challenge my theology about what I've experienced in the contact with suffering. Like what is wrestled, like I do in my pastoral care class, with issues of theodicy. Like how do we then make sense of, there is our participation in this process, right? In co-creating both good and evil in the world that comes with our with original sin, although I don't know that I have held on to that too tightly anymore. So this is a beautiful conversation. I just have really, that's been always, in the background, but it never comes so much in the forefront anymore. But I'm so happy that you detected it. Well, in some spaces, it's not, that cool anymore to speak explicit theological language. I know here it is, but, that's part of the interdisciplinary spaces that I've been. Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture. You had mentioned kind of at several places the idea of kind of transforming and reshifting identity through trauma, and thinking about this from an African kind of American perspective, which I come from. I'm wondering what challenges and possibilities you've noticed from the theological perspective of trauma and restructuring their identity, not just of their own selves, but how they view God and how they view kind of things from a systematic theological perspective, kind of recognizing that within a lot of traditions that many of us are familiar with, there is the adage of, everything happens for a reason, how trauma plays into that. And so how does an issue, restructuring and shrinking of the trauma zone kind of impact kind of the way that they wrestle with that theological kind of foundation that they've kind of held on to for so long?
I don't know that I can speak, from my understanding of African American experience per se, but just today in class we were talking about this phenomenon of spiritual bypass, which is, one way that theology or spirituality is used in order not to deal with trauma or not to deal with woundedness. And one of my students from Philadelphia is actually defending her dissertation tomorrow on this, and she researched particularly the African American community, because her suspiciousness was that there are certain spaces where there is no movement, to embrace suffering and wanting to move away from it. There is a theologizing of it that is more paralyzing, that is not helping move through. And so I don't know what the community is doing, to break through that and to reimagine, a different way of healing the wounds, But I think churches do amazing work with that. Some churches, some have a theology that is paralyzing, and some I think are liberating. And but if you have experience of that, or if you have thoughts about that, that's a beautiful, contribution to this, because I think it is true that some communities get stuck because they have kind of a counterproductive theology, from my perspective, like that doesn't really help them embrace the healing work. It finds a justification for it, and that's the idea of bypassing it, or going over, not through, which is the way. So, no more questions, huh? Because I'm like, I'm on the deadline. Thank you.